door right now or I'm breaking it down.
Can you first tell me what this is about?
We got a call about a disturbance. You need to step outside.
A disturbance? I'm a nurse. I worked a double shift. I've been asleep for 2 hours.
Ma'am, last warning!
Nothing about the door looked dangerous. It was just after midnight when a uniformed officer stepped into the light of a quiet residential porch and spoke with the certainty of someone used to being obeyed. His tone was calm, controlled, procedural. From his perspective, this was a minor interaction, a routine assertion of authority, a moment that would be forgotten by morning. It wasn't. What the officer did not acknowledge was the camera mounted inches from his face, recording every word, every pause, every decision. He did not recognize the line he was about to cross, or how clearly it would later be preserved. Years from that night, his career would be over. A city would authorize an $860,000 payout. The record would be permanent. The collapse did not begin with violence. It began with a knock and a choice that could not be taken back. The officer did not raise his voice. He did not rush. Everything about his posture suggested control. He stood squarely in the doorway, framed by the porch light, issuing instructions as if the space in front of him were no longer private. The words were delivered with practiced confidence, the kind that assumes compliance without demanding it. To anyone watching later, it would sound routine. At the moment, it was presented as procedure. Inside the home, a nurse had just returned from a late shift. No disturbance had been reported. No emergency justified the intrusion. Yet the authority at the door behaved as though justification was unnecessary. Presence alone was treated as permission. What followed was not a confrontation. There was no shouting, no visible threat, only an expectation that the badge settled every question. Each sentence narrowed the options. Each pause carried weight. The imbalance was subtle but unmistakable. This was the point of no return, though no one acknowledged it. The officer believed the situation was contained, that nothing significant was happening, that the system would protect the decision he was making in real time. It would not, because every second of this exchange was being documented, and once authority is recorded exceeding its limits, the outcome is no longer a matter of opinion. It becomes a matter of record. The woman inside the home was not someone accustomed to confrontation. Her days were structured around routines that demanded precision, restraint, and accountability. As a nurse, her professional life revolved around following protocols, respecting authority hierarchies, and managing high-stress situations without escalation. She was trained to de-escalate, to comply with lawful instruction, and to document everything that mattered. That night was no different from many others before it. She had returned home from a late shift, the kind that leaves the body exhausted but the mind alert. Her work required long hours, emotional control, and constant awareness of rules that exist for a reason. Mistakes in her profession carried consequences. She understood that better than most. There was nothing about her background that suggested risk. No criminal history, no prior encounters with law enforcement, no pattern of instability or provocation. She lived alone, maintained steady employment, and was regarded by colleagues as reliable and disciplined. In the system she operated within, compliance was not optional. It was expected. That context matters, because when authority enters a private space, legitimacy depends not only on the badge, but on the circumstances that justify its use. Here, there was no emergency, no call for assistance, no observable threat. The situation did not originate from her actions. It arrived at her door. When she spoke, her tone reflected caution rather than defiance. Her responses were measured. She asked clarifying questions. She did not attempt to control the interaction, only to understand why it was happening. These were not the reactions of someone challenging power. They were the reactions of someone accustomed to rules and expecting them to apply consistently. This imbalance would later become critical, because the credibility of the system rests on whether authority is exercised against those who present danger or against those who simply happen to be available. In this case, the person on the receiving end of that authority was someone whose entire professional life was built on restraint, responsibility, and adherence to lawful process. That contrast would not fade as the story unfolded. It would sharpen. Before the knock, nothing was out of place. The house was quiet. The street outside showed no signs of disruption. There were no flashing lights cutting through the windows, no raised voices, no urgency that would suggest an unfolding situation. Inside, the routine was familiar: keys set down, shoes removed, the slow transition from a clinical environment back to private space. This was the final moment in which everything remained normal. From a legal standpoint, nothing had yet occurred that justified an intrusion. No call for service originated from the residence. No complaint had been logged against the occupant. No observable condition met the threshold for intervention. At this stage, the law recognized the space as private and protected. When the doorbell rang, it did not immediately register as a threat. It was late, but not unheard of. Emergency workers often keep irregular hours. Deliveries run behind schedule. The sound itself carried no warning. It was simply unexpected. When the door was opened, the scene remained calm. The officer was alone. His demeanor appeared neutral. His presence did not announce danger. It implied authority. The encounter had not yet crossed into conflict. It existed in a narrow window where choices still mattered. This is the moment most people never consider. The point at which nothing unlawful has happened and nothing irreversible has occurred, where a simple explanation, a brief clarification, or a decision to disengage would have ended the interaction entirely. Instead, the exchange continued. Questions were asked that did not clearly connect to any visible issue. Statements were made that implied obligation without explaining cause. The officer's tone suggested that cooperation was assumed, not requested. Still, the interaction remained outwardly calm. No commands were shouted. No threats were explicit. That normalcy is important, because when authority later claimed necessity, the record would show none. The escalation did not emerge from chaos. It emerged from quiet. This was the last point at which the encounter could have ended without consequence. The last moment before procedure became pressure, before presence became leverage. The line had not yet been crossed, but it was now within reach. The shift did not happen all at once. It never does. The officer's language began to change subtly, almost imperceptibly. What had sounded like inquiry took on the shape of instruction. Clarifications became expectations. The space between request and command narrowed until it was no longer clear that a choice existed at all. He positioned himself closer to the threshold, speaking with the assumption that compliance was procedural, not conditional. His authority was no longer framed as situational. It was treated as inherent. The badge, not the circumstances, became the justification. From the outside, this would later be described as calm, no shouting, no physical contact. But escalation does not require volume. It requires pressure. And the pressure was applied through implication rather than force. Statements were made that suggested consequences without naming them. References to procedure replaced explanations. The officer did not say what would happen if compliance was withheld. He did not need to. The structure of the interaction implied it. This was authority functioning on expectation, not consent. The nurse's responses remained measured. She did not raise her voice. She did not insult or threaten. She asked why certain actions were necessary. She attempted to anchor the exchange in clarity. Each question, however, was treated as resistance. That interpretation marked a critical turn. In many encounters, escalation is justified retroactively by the subject's behavior. Here, the record would later show that behavior remained consistent. What changed was the officer's tolerance for explanation. The moment questions were no longer acceptable, authority shifted from lawful engagement to enforcement posture. The officer referenced obligations that were not clearly applicable. He asserted control over a space that had not been lawfully ceded. His tone carried certainty, but his statements lacked specificity. This imbalance would later matter, because escalation without cause does not appear dramatic in real time. It appears procedural. It sounds like protocol. It feels ordinary to those accustomed to issuing commands. At no point did the officer articulate an emergency. There was no immediate threat that required decisive action, yet urgency was implied. Time was compressed. Options were narrowed. The nurse was positioned as the variable that needed correction. This is how authority becomes coercive without appearing aggressive. Each additional sentence reduced the likelihood of disengagement. Each moment spent at the doorway increased the officer's investment in control. Walking away would have required acknowledgement that the encounter lacked justification. That option quietly disappeared. The nurse remained inside her home. She did not attempt to flee. She did not attempt to end the recording. Her posture suggested compliance with lawful process, not submission to undefined demands. The distinction would later become significant, but in the moment, it went unrecognized. The officer's confidence appeared unshaken. He spoke as though the outcome was already determined, as though the system would absorb whatever decision he made at the threshold of that door. That belief was not uncommon. It was also incorrect, because while authority can escalate silently, evidence escalates differently. It accumulates. It preserves tone, sequence, and context. It does not rely on recollection or justification. It records. And every second of this exchange was being stored. What followed was not sudden. It was inevitable. Once authority exceeded its limits without correction, the cost was no longer avoidable. The only variable left was how clearly that excess would be documented. The escalation had reached its peak without ever announcing itself. The system had already taken note. At this stage of the encounter, the law had already begun to matter more than anyone present seemed to realize. In the United States, an officer's authority at a private residence is not unlimited. Presence alone does not create jurisdiction. Absent a warrant, exigent circumstances, or voluntary consent, the threshold of a home remains one of the most protected spaces under constitutional law. These limits are not technicalities. They exist to draw a line between investigation and intrusion. What unfolded at the doorway brushed against that line repeatedly. The officer's statements suggested obligation, yet they were not paired with a clear legal basis. No warrant was presented, no emergency was articulated. No consent was explicitly requested in a manner that allowed refusal without consequence. Instead, compliance was framed as assumed. This distinction would later become central. From the resident's perspective, this is where most people make decisions that work against them. Faced with an authoritative tone, many comply reflexively, believing refusal itself may escalate the situation. The law, however, draws a sharp distinction between voluntary cooperation and submission under implied pressure. That difference is not determined by a single word. It is determined by context, tone, positioning, and sequence. Courts examine whether a reasonable person would have felt free to decline. At this doorway, that freedom was narrowing. The officer's posture and proximity mattered. So did his phrasing. Statements that suggest inevitability rather than choice carry legal consequences. When authority presents itself as mandatory without lawful foundation, the interaction begins to shift from consensual to coercive. Another checkpoint emerged in the officer's response to questioning. Asking why an officer is present or what authority justifies an instruction is not unlawful. It does not create suspicion. It does not negate cooperation. When such questions are treated as resistance, the legal balance tilts. This is a point many viewers overlook. Escalation is often justified after the fact by labeling ordinary clarification as defiance. The record here would later show that the nurse's conduct remained calm and consistent. What changed was the officer's interpretation. The absence of clear explanation also mattered. Lawful authority is strongest when it is transparent. Vague references to procedure or policy without articulation weaken that authority, particularly in private spaces. Courts look closely at whether an officer could clearly state the legal reason for remaining, directing, or demanding compliance. At this checkpoint, that clarity was missing. The final legal boundary involved duration. Even brief encounters can become unlawful if they are prolonged without justification. Each additional moment at the door increased the burden on the officer to explain why the encounter continued. Silence on that point would later speak loudly. None of this was dramatic in real time. No statute was cited. No rights were recited. The law operated quietly, in the background, waiting for documentation. And it was being documented. By the time the exchange reached its later stages, the question was no longer whether authority had been asserted. It was whether it had been supported. The answer would not come from testimony. It would come from the recording. The legal checkpoints had been crossed. The consequences had not yet arrived. The moment authority lost control of the narrative was not marked by a confrontation. It was marked by a recording. The doorbell camera did not react. It did not interpret. It did not escalate. It simply continued to capture what was happening in front of it, second by second, without regard for intent or justification. Where memory can blur, The camera preserved sequence, tone, and timing with precision. What the footage revealed later was not a single dramatic violation, but a pattern. The officer's language, initially neutral, gradually assumed inevitability. Requests took on the shape of directives. Pauses grew shorter. The space between explanation and enforcement collapsed. Most critically, the recording established context. It showed the absence of urgency, no visible threat, no emergent condition. The calm environment undercut any later claim that speed or decisiveness had been required. The law does not evaluate authority in isolation. It evaluates it against what was objectively present. Audio mattered as much as video. Inflection, pacing, and phrasing became evidence. Statements that suggested obligation without explanation were preserved exactly as delivered. When authority is reviewed after the fact, tone often carries as much weight as content. The camera also documented what did not happen. There was no aggression from inside the home, no refusal accompanied by hostility, no attempt to evade. The nurse's demeanor remained controlled throughout. This absence would later become as important as any action captured. As the footage was reviewed, frame by frame, it began to shift the balance of power. Internal reviewers did not need to speculate. Attorneys did not need to rely solely on recollection. The sequence spoke for itself. Once evidence exists in this form, institutional response changes. Risk assessments are recalculated. Explanations are measured against objective record rather than narrative. Authority no longer defines the story. Documentation does. The doorbell camera also established continuity. There were no gaps, no missing moments that could be explained away. The entire exchange existed as a single, uninterrupted record. That continuity limited the range of plausible justifications. At this stage, the issue was no longer whether the officer believed he was acting appropriately. Belief is not the standard. Reasonableness is. And reasonableness is evaluated by what a neutral observer would conclude from the evidence. The reversal was quiet but decisive. The recording did not accuse. It did not editorialize. It simply removed ambiguity. From that point forward, the outcome was no longer determined by rank, uniform, or testimony. It was determined by data. The system responds differently when the facts are fixed. Authority had been exercised. Evidence had taken over. As the footage moved beyond initial review, attention began to shift away from the individual officer and toward the structure that had enabled the encounter to unfold the way it did. Isolated misconduct is easier to resolve. Systems prefer it that way. A single bad decision can be disciplined, corrected, and contained. What proved more difficult in this case was that the recording did not depict confusion or misjudgment. It depicted familiarity. The officer's tone, pacing, and assumption suggested behavior that had been practiced before without consequence. Internal review processes began pulling related records, prior complaints, informal warnings, use of authority reports that had been closed without escalation. None of these incidents alone had triggered significant action. Together, they formed a pattern. This is how institutional failure rarely announces itself. Not through one egregious act, but through repetition that goes uncorrected. The footage raised questions supervisors could not ignore. Why was an officer comfortable asserting authority at a private residence without articulating a legal basis? Why were procedural explanations absent? Why did questioning trigger escalation rather than clarification? These were not questions about temperament. They were questions about training, oversight, and enforcement of policy. Reviewers noted that the officer's conduct aligned with informal norms rather than written standards. Policy manuals were clear on thresholds. Practice, however, appeared more flexible. That gap mattered. The system had mechanisms designed to prevent precisely this kind of overreach. Body-worn cameras, use of force reporting, supervisory review. Yet none of those safeguards had engaged at the moment they were needed most. The doorbell camera, an external device outside departmental control, had filled the void. This raised a more uncomfortable issue. Accountability had arrived not because internal systems functioned as intended, but because an independent record existed. That distinction would later influence how the case was framed. As legal counsel became involved, the scope widened further. Attorneys examined whether the officer's actions reflected departmental custom rather than deviation. In civil rights litigation, This question is decisive. Liability does not require proving intent. It requires demonstrating that the system tolerated conduct that predictably led to rights violations. Training materials were scrutinized, field guidance was reviewed, supervisory practices were evaluated. The absence of corrective action in earlier incidents weakened the city's position. Silence, in this context, functioned as endorsement. Importantly, no single document condemned the system outright. Instead, the failure emerged through accumulation. Missed opportunities to intervene. Complaints resolved without follow-up. Patterns normalized because they were familiar. The nurse's case became representative, not exceptional. It exposed how easily authority could expand when not actively constrained. How procedures intended to protect rights could become abstract if not reinforced. This shift from individual behavior to institutional responsibility changed the stakes. Remedies were no longer limited to discipline. They now included policy review, training reform, and financial exposure. The city's risk profile altered dramatically. The system had not collapsed. It had been revealed, and once revealed, it could no longer claim ignorance. The legal process moved slowly, but it moved in only one direction. Once the evidence was assessed alongside internal records, the question was no longer whether the officer's conduct was appropriate. It was whether the city could defend it. The answer became increasingly difficult to sustain. Administrative action came first. The officer's authority was suspended, pending review. Internal findings cited failures to articulate legal basis, improper escalation, and conduct inconsistent with departmental standards. These conclusions did not rely on interpretation. They relied on what had been recorded. Termination followed. The loss of the badge was not framed as punitive, but as necessary. Trust, once compromised in documented form, could not be restored through explanation. The officer's career effectively ended there. Civil proceedings unfolded on a parallel track. Attorneys evaluated exposure not only for the actions at the door, but for the institutional context that allowed them. The recording shortened timelines. Depositions were constrained by the footage. Arguments were limited by sequence and tone already preserved. Negotiations focused on risk. Trial carried uncertainty, but the evidence reduced it in one direction. A jury would not be asked to imagine what happened. They would be shown. The city authorized a settlement of $860,000. That figure was not symbolic. It reflected calculated liability, emotional distress, violation of constitutional protections, and the cost of systemic failure. Settlements at this level are not admissions of intent. They are acknowledgments of exposure. Importantly, the payment was not absorbed quietly. It required public approval. Budget allocations were adjusted. Records were entered. The outcome became permanent. For the nurse, the resolution did not erase the encounter. It did not retroactively restore privacy. What it did was establish that the law recognized the harm and responded through formal channels. For the department, consequences extended beyond the officer. Training protocols were reviewed. Supervisory review thresholds were adjusted. Documentation requirements were reinforced. These changes were not framed as reform narratives. They were framed as risk mitigation. This is how legal accountability functions in practice. Not through dramatic declarations, but through process. Through documentation, through consequences that cannot be undone. The system did not move quickly, but once it moved, it did not reverse. Authority had been exercised improperly. The law responded in kind. The resolution of the case did not close the matter. It extended it. Once the settlement was finalized and the officer's termination entered the public record, the implications moved beyond the individuals directly involved. The case became a reference point inside legal departments, training briefings, and risk assessments, not as a scandal, but as an example. Municipal leaders framed the outcome in measured language. Statements emphasized review, clarification, and adherence to established standards. There were no emotional appeals. The response was procedural, reflecting an understanding that the real damage had occurred quietly, over time. Within law enforcement circles, the footage was circulated in controlled settings, not for punishment, but for instruction. It demonstrated how authority can exceed its limits without overt aggression, how tone and implication can carry as much legal weight as force, how private spaces amplify constitutional scrutiny, For civil rights practitioners, the case reinforced a familiar principle. Documentation changes outcomes. Independent recording shifts power dynamics in ways internal systems often do not. The presence of objective evidence compresses timelines and narrows defenses. Policy adjustments followed. Departments reviewed guidance on residential encounters. Emphasis was placed on articulating legal basis, recognizing when presence alone is insufficient and disengaging when justification cannot be established. These changes were incremental, but they were direct. The case also entered broader public understanding. It reminded residents that lawful authority has boundaries, and that those boundaries are enforceable, not through confrontation, but through process. What remained at the end was not outrage. It was precedent, a record showing that quiet overreach carries measurable cost, that careers can end without a single raised voice, that accountability, when documented, does not require spectacle. The law had spoken, and it had done so in the only language systems consistently respond to: consequence.